March 17, 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. Sergeant Robert Hartley pressed his forehead against the cool window of the administration building, watching the convoy of trucks roll through the main gate. He'd been stationed at prisoner camps for 18 months now, processing captured German soldiers with mechanical efficiency. But today was different. Today the trucks carried women. The memo had arrived 3 days earlier, terse and administrative. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 53 female auxiliaries from the Wehrmacht, captured during the Rhine crossing, would arrive for processing and temporary housing before transfer to a permanent facility. Hartley had read it twice, trying to imagine what that meant. He'd seen plenty of German men, from arrogant SS officers to frightened teenage conscripts. But women? The war had never prepared him for that. The first woman who stepped from the truck moved with rigid military bearing, despite obvious exhaustion. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, dirt crusted along the hem, but she held her chin level as her eyes scanned the compound. Behind her, others emerged, ranging from perhaps 19 to 40-something, each carrying the same wary defiance. Hartley found himself holding his breath, struck by how utterly unprepared he was for this moment. Oberaufseherin Greta Zimmermann had commanded the auxiliary communications unit attached to the 17th Panzer Division. 3 weeks ago, she'd been coordinating radio dispatches in a bunker outside Remagen. Now she stood in the Texas prison camp, watching American soldiers watch her. She recognized the uncertainty in their faces. Good. Uncertainty was better than cruelty, and she'd prepared her women for cruelty. The processing took 4 hours. Photographs, fingerprints, medical examinations conducted by a female army nurse who spoke no German, forms in triplicate documenting possessions, rank, unit designation, capture circumstances. Through it all, Zimmermann maintained discipline among her subordinates. No tears, no complaints, no signs of weakness that might invite exploitation. They were still German soldiers, even if they wore skirts instead of trousers. Hartley observed from his station near the processing desk, officially supervising, but mostly trying to understand what he was seeing. These women weren't civilians caught in crossfire. They'd worn uniforms, served in military roles, operated communications equipment in combat zones. The Geneva Convention technically covered them, but nobody had anticipated female German prisoners in significant numbers. The camp had prepared barracks, arranged for female guards, established protocols. What they hadn't prepared for was the sheer strangeness of the situation. The barracks assigned to the women occupied the northeast corner of Camp Swift, originally built for officers but hastily modified. Separate latrine facilities, reinforced locks, additional lighting. Captain Morris had inspected everything personally, clearly nervous about potential problems. Housing enemy women created complications nobody wanted to discuss openly. What if they attempted escape? What if male prisoners tried to make contact? What if the local civilians objected to women being held here? Zimmermann surveyed the barracks with professional assessment. 26 bunks, thin mattresses but adequate blankets, 2 wood-burning stoves for heat, windows with bars. Better than the field conditions they'd endured for the past month. Better than the temporary holding facility in France where they'd spent 5 days. Not better than home, but home no longer existed in any form she could bear to imagine. That first evening, Hartley drew guard duty on the women's section. He walked the perimeter path, acutely aware of voices drifting from the barracks. German words he couldn't understand, occasional laughter that sounded forced, someone crying quietly until others shushed her. He'd guarded plenty of German men who had cried in the night, missing home or processing the reality of defeat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Somehow, the sound of a woman crying felt different, though he couldn't articulate why. The camp commander, Colonel William Bradford, called a special briefing the next morning for all personnel assigned to the women's section. Bradford was a West Point graduate who'd spent 2 years establishing Camp Swift as a model facility. He didn't appreciate complications, and female prisoners definitely qualified as complications. "Listen carefully," Bradford began, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone who'd given a lot of orders. "These prisoners will be treated with absolute correctness according to Geneva Convention standards. No familiarity, no personal conversations beyond necessary communication, no gifts or special treatment. They are enemy soldiers despite being women, and you will remember that at all times. Any violation of proper conduct will result in immediate reassignment and possible court-martial. Is that understood?" The assembled guards, including Hartley, responded with uniform acknowledgement. But Hartley noticed the tension in the room. Young men who trained to guard dangerous enemies now faced the prospect of guarding women who looked exhausted and frightened. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. Zimmermann established routine immediately. Morning formation at 600 hours. Barracks inspection at 6:30. Breakfast at 700. She assigned her women specific duties, maintaining the structure they'd known in service. Morale depended on routine, on maintaining dignity through discipline. Without it, they would dissolve into exactly what the Americans probably expected: helpless females waiting to be rescued or pitied. The mess hall situation created the first real problem. Colonel Bradford had decided the women would eat separately from male prisoners, using a different schedule to avoid contact. This meant the women took breakfast at 700 hours before the main prisoner population. It also meant they were the first Germans to experience what the cooks served that morning. Hartley was present when the women filed into the mess hall, moving in orderly formation despite no requirement to do so. They'd been told to take trays and proceed through the serving line. Simple enough. What nobody had explained was what they'd find in the serving line. The cook on duty that morning was Corporal James Wilson from Amarillo, a big man with permanent flour dust on his apron who'd worked in his family's diner before the war. Wilson took pride in his cooking and had been experimenting with breakfast options to break the monotony of standard Army fare. This morning, inspired by the Texas spring weather, he prepared something special. The first woman in line, a young auxiliary named Hilga Fisher, stared at her tray in complete confusion. A large biscuit, split open and steaming, and covering it, draped over it, drowning it, a thick white gravy studded with chunks of something she couldn't identify. The smell was overwhelming, rich and heavy and utterly foreign. Fisher looked at Wilson, then at the gravy, then back at Wilson. Her English was limited to a few phrases learned during processing. "This is food?" she asked, her tone making clear she suspected some kind of mistake or possibly a joke at her expense. Wilson grinned broadly, misunderstanding her confusion for curiosity. "Biscuits and gravy, ma'am. Best breakfast in Texas. You're gonna love it. Got sausage in the gravy. Made it fresh this morning. Plenty more if you want seconds." Fisher took her tray to a table and sat down and stared at the biscuits and gravy as other women joined her with identical servings. They examined the food with expressions ranging from bewilderment to suspicion. Nobody ate. They were waiting for Zimmermann, who would determine whether this strange concoction was safe or acceptable. Zimmermann studied her own tray with military analysis. The biscuit appeared to be some form of bread, though unlike any bread she'd known. The gravy resembled nothing in German cuisine. The chunks might be meat, though the gravy's pale color suggested otherwise. The entire presentation violated every principle of proper food arrangement she'd been raised with. Germans kept food separate on the plate. This was chaos, everything mixed together in white slop. Hartley watched from his position near the mess hall entrance, suddenly aware that something significant was happening. The women weren't eating. They sat in silence,
53 German military women staring at their breakfast like it might attack them. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that they didn't know what they were looking at. He approached Zimmermann's table, careful to maintain proper distance. "The biscuits and gravy, ma'am. It's a traditional American breakfast, very common, especially in the South. The white sauce is made from milk and flour with cooked sausage. The biscuit is a type of bread. It's good food, I promise, not a trick." Zimmermann met his eyes directly. "In Germany, we do not pour sauce on bread. This is strange to us." Hartley felt suddenly defensive of Southern cooking, which was absurd given the circumstances. "I understand, ma'am, but I think if you try it, you might find it's actually pretty good. Corporal Wilson is a fine cook. He's not trying to insult you or anything like that. This is real food that Americans eat." Zimmermann made her decision. She picked up her fork, cut a piece of biscuit with gravy, and ate it. Her expression remained neutral as she chewed, processing the experience. The other women watched intently, waiting for her verdict. The gravy was rich, almost to the point of overwhelming. The biscuit beneath it was soft, flaky, completely different from the dense rye bread she'd known all her life. The sausage added salt and a hint of spice she couldn't identify. It was strange. It was heavy. It was unlike anything she'd expected. And it was, she had to admit, not bad. Different, certainly. Peculiar in its construction, but not unpleasant. She swallowed and nodded to her women. "It is acceptable. Eat." Permission granted, the women began eating with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some found the gravy too rich after months of limited rations. Others discovered they were hungry enough that anything warm and filling qualified as good. A few clearly disliked it, but ate anyway, unwilling to waste food when they didn't know what the next meal might bring. Hartley retreated to his post, oddly relieved that the breakfast had been accepted. He couldn't explain why it mattered. They were prisoners. They'd eat what they were served. But something about the exchange, about Zimmermann's careful testing and approval, about the women's disciplined response, had humanized a situation he'd been trying to keep abstract.
Over the next week, biscuits and gravy appeared 3 more times at breakfast. Wilson rotated between standard offerings, pancakes, oatmeal, scrambled eggs, and his beloved Southern specialty. Each time, the women ate it with less confusion and more acceptance. Some even began to show signs of enjoyment, though they'd never admit that to the American guards. Hartley found himself assigned to the women's section more frequently. Captain Morris had noticed he'd handled the initial processing well, maintained proper conduct, seemed reliable. So Hartley became one of the regular guards, walking perimeter during day shifts, supervising work details when the women were assigned to laundry or administrative tasks. He observed them carefully, trying to understand who they were beyond their uniforms and prisoner status. Zimmermann clearly commanded absolute respect, maintaining discipline through force of personality rather than intimidation. A woman named Marguerite Stein served as her second, handling logistics and mediating minor disputes. The younger women deferred to both, maintaining the military hierarchy they'd known in service. But beneath the discipline, Hartley detected something else. These women were processing defeat in ways the male prisoners didn't quite show. They'd lost their country, their military, their purpose. Many had lost family members. Most faced uncertain futures in a devastated homeland. And they were doing it while maintaining facades of strength that looked exhausting to maintain. The second significant incident occurred on March 29th, 12 days after arrival. Wilson had prepared an especially large batch of biscuits and gravy that morning, anticipating the women had developed a taste for it. He'd added extra sausage, adjusted the seasoning, taken particular care with the biscuit texture. When the women filed through the line, he served generous portions with obvious pride. Zimmermann sat with her tray, ready to eat, when young Helga Fischer suddenly began crying. Not quiet tears, but gasping sobs that shook her shoulders. The mess hall fell silent. Every woman turned to look. Zimmermann's expression hardened. "Fischer, control yourself," Zimmermann ordered, her voice sharp. But Fischer couldn't stop. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry, Oberaufseherin. It's just that the food is so good, and we're prisoners, and my mother is probably starving in Hamburg, and I'm eating better than I ever ate at home, and I don't understand why they're feeding us like this. I don't understand any of this." The confession hung in the air. Other women looked down at their trays, clearly sharing Fischer's confusion, even if they controlled their emotional responses better. Zimmermann's jaw tightened. This was the moment she'd been dreading, when the cognitive dissonance became too much and discipline cracked. Hartley watched from his position, uncertain whether to intervene. This seemed like an internal matter, something for Zimmermann to handle. But Fischer's words had struck him, particularly the part about her mother starving in Hamburg while she ate biscuits and gravy in Texas. The war's absurdity was crystallized in that moment. Zimmermann stood, drawing every eye in the mess hall. "Listen to me, all of you. We are prisoners of war. We were captured in service to Germany. The Americans are obligated by international law to feed us adequately. That they feed us well is their choice, reflecting their abundance and their values. We do not apologize for being fed. We do not feel guilty for receiving proper treatment. We maintain our dignity and our discipline regardless of circumstances. Fischer, finish your breakfast. All of you, finish your breakfast."
"We will discuss this later in barracks." The women obeyed, eating in renewed silence. But something had shifted. The question Fischer had asked, "Why are they feeding us like this?" hung over the meal like smoke. That evening, Hartley was assigned to evening perimeter walk. As he passed the women's barracks, he heard voices through the walls. Zimmermann was addressing her unit, her German too rapid for his limited vocabulary, but the tone unmistakable. She was lecturing them, reinforcing discipline, reminding them of their duties as soldiers even in captivity. But then, another voice spoke, older and quieter. Hartley recognized it as Margaret Stein. She spoke for several minutes, while others listened. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was reflective, questioning, exploring ideas rather than issuing commands. Later, Hartley learned from the German-speaking sergeant, who sometimes translated for command, that Stein had said something that stuck with the women. She'd asked them to consider what kind of enemy feeds prisoners not just adequately, but generously. What kind of country had so much abundance that even enemies received biscuits and gravy made with real butter and fresh sausage? What did that say about American strength versus German strength, if America could afford generosity while Germany couldn't feed its own people? The questions were dangerous because they led to uncomfortable conclusions. If America was so weak and decadent as propaganda claimed, why were the prisoners eating better than they had in Germany? If democratic societies were chaotic and inefficient, why did the camp run with such smooth organization? If Americans were supposed to be cruel to prisoners, why did Corporal Wilson take such obvious pride in making good biscuits and gravy? Zimmermann couldn't stop the questions. She could maintain discipline, enforce behavior, keep her women together as a military unit, but she couldn't prevent them from thinking, from observing, from slowly revising their understanding of who the Americans were and what that meant. The third week brought warmer weather and a new development. Colonel Bradford decided the women needed outdoor work assignments to maintain physical health and mental occupation. Sitting idle in barracks wasn't good for anyone, so work details were organized, supervised by female Army personnel when possible, and by carefully selected male guards when necessary. Hartley found himself supervising a detail of 8 women assigned to the camp garden. Camp Swift maintained a large vegetable garden that supplemented food supplies and provided occupational therapy for prisoners willing to work.
The women were tasked with preparing soil beds for spring planting, spreading compost, marking rows for seeds. The work was simple but physical. Within an hour, the women had shed their uniform jackets, working in undershirts despite the cool morning air. Hartley maintained proper distance, observing without interfering. They worked efficiently, coordinating without much discussion, falling into the rhythm of physical labor. During the mid-morning break, Hartley distributed water canteens. As he handed one to Zimmermann, she spoke in careful English. "The breakfast today, the biscuits, they are better each time. Your cook learns our preferences, perhaps." Hartley was surprised by the comment. It was the first time Zimmermann had initiated conversation beyond necessary communication. "Wilson does take pride in his cooking, ma'am. I think he's pleased that you and your unit appreciate it." Zimmermann took a long drink of water. "In Germany, before the war, I taught school, mathematics. I enjoyed cooking on weekends, traditional dishes, sauerbraten, schnitzel, black forest cake. Food was important in my family. My mother taught me that preparing good food showed respect for those who would eat it. I recognize that your Corporal Wilson shows this respect."
Hartley felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't just about biscuits and gravy. This was about recognizing shared humanity through the universal language of food prepared with care. Wilson wasn't trying to impress the prisoners or demonstrate American superiority. He was simply doing what he'd always done, making good food because that's what cooks did. "I'll tell Wilson you said so, ma'am. I think he'd appreciate hearing it." Zimmermann nodded and returned to work. The brief conversation ended, but Hartley found himself thinking about it for the rest of the day. A German teacher who'd been conscripted into military service, who'd operated radio equipment in combat zones, who now worked in a Texas garden and appreciated good biscuits and gravy. The war suddenly seemed more complicated than simple categories of enemy and ally, German and American, prisoner and guard. That night, Wilson was serving dinner when Hartley passed along Zimmermann's comment. The big cook's face split into a genuine grin. "She said that? Really said the biscuits showed respect?" Hartley confirmed it, watching Wilson's reaction with interest. "Well, damn," Wilson said, his Texas drawl thick with pleasure. "I mean, I just cook, you know, but if the food makes folks feel respected, even folks we're at war with, I guess that's something. Maybe I'll make extra biscuits tomorrow, do up a real nice batch of gravy. They deserve to eat good, same as anyone else." Hartley left the kitchen wondering what Captain Morris or Colonel Bradford would make of this conversation. A cook, pleased that enemy prisoners appreciated his food. A guard, learning about a prisoner's life before the war. Small human connections forming across the gulf of conflict. It wasn't in any manual or regulation, it just was happening, one breakfast at a time. By April 1945, the routine had solidified into something approaching normalcy. The women rose at dawn, maintained their barracks with military precision, worked their assigned details, and ate meals that continued to surprise them with their abundance. The biscuits and gravy had become a fixture, appearing twice weekly with variations that Wilson introduced. Sometimes he added cheese, other times he experimented with different seasonings. The women had stopped questioning it and simply accepted that American breakfast included pouring thick sauce over bread. Hartley had been transferred permanently to the women's section, his conduct deemed exemplary by Captain Morris. He walked the same paths daily, observed the same faces, learned to recognize individual women beyond their uniforms. Helga Fischer, who'd broken down crying over breakfast, had become one of the hardest workers in the garden detail. Marguerite Stein maintained a small notebook where she recorded observations about American camp life in neat script. Zimmermann continued commanding her diminished unit with the same discipline she'd shown in combat, though Hartley noticed the rigid bearing had softened slightly as weeks passed. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. News reached Camp Swift within hours. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The conflict was over. Hartley expected celebration among the guards and despair among the prisoners. What he witnessed was more complicated. The women received the news in silence during evening formation. Zimmermann delivered the information in German, her voice steady, then dismissed them to barracks. No wailing, no protests, just quiet acceptance of what they'd known was coming. That evening,
Hartley heard singing from the barracks. Not patriotic songs or military marches, but folk melodies that sounded ancient and mournful. The women were mourning not the regime's fall, but the end of the world they'd known, however flawed it had been. Hartley stood in the darkness listening, feeling intrusive but unable to walk away from the raw emotion in those voices.
Wilson served biscuits and gravy the next morning, perhaps trying to maintain normalcy through routine. The women ate mechanically, processing not just food but the reality of complete defeat. Germany was occupied, divided among the victors, beginning a future nobody could predict. And they were still in Texas, eating breakfast prepared by an enemy who'd shown them more kindness than their own government had in years. The camp administration faced new questions with the war's end. How long would the women remain? Where would they be sent? Germany was devastated, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced. Repatriation would take months, possibly years. Meanwhile, Camp Swift would continue housing these 53 women who existed in a strange limbo between military prisoners and displaced persons. Colonel Bradford decided to expand work opportunities. The women could volunteer for paid labor in nearby towns, supervised but allowed limited freedom. Several accepted, working in laundries, helping with agricultural tasks on local farms, assisting in administrative offices that needed German translation. The money they earned was modest but represented something beyond mere survival. It was purpose, occupation, connection to life beyond barracks walls. Zimmermann was assigned to the camp library, cataloging German-language books and helping establish a lending system for prisoners. Hartley sometimes saw her there, seated at a desk surrounded by volumes, her expression absorbed in work that clearly engaged her mind after months of enforced idleness. She looked different in those moments, less like that military commander and more like the mathematics teacher she'd mentioned during that garden break. One afternoon in June, Hartley was walking past the library when Zimmermann called to him from the doorway. "Sergeant Hartley, a moment, please." He approached, curious and slightly wary. "Yes, ma'am?" She held a book, a German edition of American poetry translated years before the war. "I found this today. It contains Walt Whitman, translated quite well. I was wondering if the camp might have an English version. I would like to compare the translations, improve my English through reading." Hartley felt oddly pleased by the request. "I can check, ma'am. We've got a fair collection. If it's here, I'll find it for you." "Thank you, Sergeant." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words. "I wanted also to say that your conduct these months has been correct and respectful. It has made our situation bearable. I think you should know that is noticed and appreciated." Hartley felt heat rise in his face. "Just doing my duty, ma'am." "No," Zimmermann said quietly. "Duty is minimum requirement. What you and others here have shown is something more. The food prepared with care, the fair treatment, the small kindnesses, these exceed duty. They reflect character." She met his eyes directly. "When we eventually return to Germany, we will remember this. We will remember that enemies can be humane. That matters more than you perhaps realize." She returned to the library before Hartley could respond. He stood in the afternoon sun, her words echoing in his mind. The idea that how they treated prisoners now might influence Germany's future seemed grandiose.
Yet he couldn't dismiss it entirely. These women would return home carrying memories of Texas, of biscuits and gravy, of Americans who'd followed rules but also shown genuine humanity. That had to count for something. The summer brought intense heat that reminded the women why Texas was legendary for its temperatures. The barracks became oppressive despite open windows and electric fans. Work details shifted to early morning and late evening, avoiding the brutal midday hours. Wilson adjusted his cooking, serving lighter breakfasts when biscuits and gravy seemed too heavy for the heat. But in August, he prepared a special breakfast. He'd received extra supplies and decided to make what he called a proper Southern spread. Biscuits and gravy, yes, but also scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, bacon, fresh fruit, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. The women entered the mess hall to find tables set with more food than they'd seen at any single meal. Fisher stared at her loaded tray in disbelief. "Why so much? It is not a holiday."
Wilson overheard and laughed. "Don't need a holiday to eat good, miss. Got the supplies? Got the time? Figured you ladies deserve something special. You work hard, keep your area clean, never cause trouble. This is appreciation, Texas style." The women ate slowly, savoring food that reminded them of celebrations rather than routine meals. Hartley watched Zimmermann tackle the biscuits and gravy with something approaching enthusiasm, her usual reserve cracking to reveal genuine enjoyment. When she caught him observing, she smiled slightly and shrugged as if to say she'd given up pretending not to like it. That evening, Hartley was filing paperwork in the administration building when Captain Morris approached. "Bradford wants to extend your assignment permanently to the women's section. You've built rapport, maintained proper boundaries, shown good judgment. The women trust you as much as prisoners can trust guards. That's valuable. You willing to continue?" Hartley considered briefly. "Yes, sir, I'm willing." Morris nodded. "Good, because we might be housing them until late 1946, possibly into 47. Germany's a mess. Processing repatriation takes time, and frankly, nobody's in a hurry to send them back to starvation and rubble. They're safe here, fed, healthy. That counts for something." After Morris left, Hartley sat alone with that reality. Another year, possibly two, of walking perimeters and supervising work details and watching German women adapt to American captivity. It should have felt tedious. Instead, he felt something closer to responsibility. These women's experience in American hands would shape their understanding of democracy, of former enemies, of possibilities for Germany's future. That seemed important in ways he couldn't fully articulate. September brought news that some prisoners would be transferred to permanent facilities designed for long-term housing. The women learned they'd remain at Camp Swift, which had been designated a central location for female prisoners. Others would join them from camps across the country, consolidating the scattered population into manageable groups. When the new arrivals came in October, the original 53 welcomed them with information about camp life, unwritten rules, and the peculiarities of American food. Zimmermann briefed the newcomers personally, explaining routine and expectations, and she mentioned almost casually that the breakfast called biscuits and gravy would seem strange initially, but was actually quite good once you accepted that Americans had different ideas about proper food. Wilson rose to the challenge of feeding the expanded population, now numbering nearly 200 women. His biscuits and gravy became legendary among them, the subject of letters home describing this peculiar American meal that had become oddly comforting. Some letters were intercepted by occupation authorities and filed in reports. Army analysts noted with interest that German prisoners consistently mentioned food quality and quantity as evidence of American strength and generosity. By November 1945, Hartley had spent 8 months assigned to the women's section. He'd watched Fisher transform from a frightened teenager to a confident young woman who spoke passable English and worked efficiently in the camp administrative office. He'd observed Stein fill 3 notebooks with observations about American culture, democracy, and social organization. He'd seen Zimmermann gradually relax her rigid command posture as the context shifted from military captivity to something closer to protective custody. On Thanksgiving, Wilson prepared a feast that included turkey, certainly, but also his famous biscuits and gravy as a special side offering. The women had learned about this American holiday through conversations and English lessons. When they sat for the meal, Zimmermann stood and delivered brief remarks in German that a translator rendered into English. "We are far from our homes in circumstances we never imagined. Our country is defeated, occupied, beginning again from ruins. We do not know what our futures hold. But today we acknowledge that we have been treated with dignity and fairness by those who could have chosen otherwise. The food we eat here is better than what we ate at home before the war. That is a truth worth stating. We are grateful for this treatment, even as we grieve what has been lost. We hope that someday we can build a Germany that shows such humanity to its own people and to others." The translation ended to silence. Then Wilson, standing near the kitchen doorway, began clapping. Other guards joined in. The women looked uncertain, then several began applauding as well. It was a strange moment of connection. Enemies acknowledging shared humanity through the medium of holiday food and honest words. Hartley felt something tighten in his chest. This was why it mattered, he realized, not the food itself, but what the food represented. Abundance shared freely, care taken in preparation, respect shown through hospitality. These women would carry those memories home, would tell families and friends that Americans fed them biscuits and gravy made with real butter and fresh sausage even after the war had ended. That story would spread, would become part of Germany's collective memory of defeat and occupation, would influence attitudes toward democracy and Western alignment. The repatriation began in March 1946, processed in groups as transportation and receiving facilities became available in occupied Germany. The women left in stages, the longest serving departing first. Fischer, Stein, and others from the original group assembled for final processing in early April. Wilson prepared a farewell breakfast, biscuits and gravy naturally, made with extra care. The women ate quietly, processing the approaching end of their American captivity. After the meal, several approached Wilson to thank him personally. His face reddened with embarrassment and pleasure as he accepted their gratitude. Zimmermann was among the last to leave, delayed by paperwork complications. On her final morning, she sought out Hartley during his patrol. "Sergeant, I wanted to give you something before departure." She held out a small piece of paper. On it, she'd written an address in Bavaria. "If you ever come to Germany after your service ends, you would be welcome at my home. I return to teaching, if schools exist. I will tell my students about the American soldiers who fed us biscuits and gravy and treated us as human beings. That story deserves telling." Hartley took the paper, throat tight. "I hope you find home in good condition, ma'am. I hope the future is kind to you." "And I hope America remembers what it showed us here," Zimmermann replied. "Strength with mercy."
Abundance shared. Humanity recognized across conflict. Those are lessons Germany needs to learn, perhaps needs to be reminded to remember. She departed that afternoon with the final group. Hartley watched the transport convoy roll through the gate, carrying the last of the women back to an uncertain future. The barracks they'd occupied stood empty, ready for new occupants, or possibly to be dismantled now that their purpose had ended. Wilson found Hartley standing outside the vacant buildings an hour later. "I'm gonna miss him," the cook said quietly. "Never thought I'd say that about enemy prisoners, but it's true. They appreciated the food, worked hard, never complained. Made me feel like the cooking mattered for more than just filling stomachs." Hartley nodded. "It did matter, more than we probably realize. Those women are going home with memories of how we treated them. That influences how they think about democracy, about America, about building their future. Biscuits and gravy might seem simple, but it represented something larger." Wilson chuckled softly. "Heavy responsibility for breakfast food. But appropriate," Hartley thought. "Wars are decided by weapons and strategy, but the peace that follows is shaped by smaller moments. Food shared, kindness offered, humanity recognized." 53 German women had arrived at Camp Swift expecting harsh treatment and minimal survival. They discovered instead that their enemies fed them biscuits and gravy made with care, treated them with respect, and showed them what democracy looked like in practice, rather than propaganda. Those women would return to Germany carrying those lessons. They'd tell their families, teach their students, influence their communities. The transformation wouldn't be immediate or universal, but it would spread. And someday, perhaps, Germany would rebuild as a nation that understood strength could be generous, that abundance was meant for sharing, and that treating even enemies with humanity was a mark of true power rather than weakness. Hartley kept Zimmermann's address in his wallet throughout his remaining service. He never made it to Germany, but he heard years later through veteran networks that she'd indeed returned to teaching mathematics in a rebuilt school. She'd written a small memoir about her war service in captivity that included detailed descriptions of American prison camps and the peculiar breakfast called biscuits and gravy that had challenged every assumption she'd held about her enemies. The memoir became required reading in some German schools, used to teach about the war's end and the American occupation's surprising humanity. Students learned that defeat had brought not just destruction, but also unexpected kindness.
that enemies had fed them better than their own government, that democracy meant treating all people with dignity, even when you didn't have to. And somewhere in those lessons, transmitted through generations, the memory of biscuits and gravy served in a Texas prison camp became a small but significant piece of why Germany and America became allies rather than remaining enemies. Because food prepared with care and shared without malice can accomplish what weapons and speeches cannot. It can transform understanding one breakfast at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.